Hi there, Telebait here with another Legends of Runeterra deck guide. Last week we had a bunch more cards drop and these completed the Targon expansion, and these also created a lot more interesting ways to play the game, especially two of the new champions, Viktor and Riven. There are so many different ways you can build these cards. For my first deck using these new cards, I went for a Viktor and Zoe Elusive deck, but the real MVP of this deck is Neandroid. This card is absolutely insane and is what the whole deck is built around. Elusive is just such a strong keyword because it reduces your opponent's options to interact with you. Stopping your opponent from being able to block is just such a strong effect. Here's the final deck list that I was happy with. For elusive cards, I went for Neandroid and Submersible, and these are the key win conditions of the deck. And your focus isn't actually around your champions like a lot of other decks. So Viktor and Zoe, quite often I'm okay to let die if it means my big elusive units stay alive. That being said, leveling up cards like Viktor and especially leveling up Zoe leveled up is just absolutely insane in this deck because using her effect you can grant all your units elusive, which is absolutely insane. So your champions can act as secondary win conditions, and Viktor gives himself different keywords every time you use his Hex Core upgrade. Elusive is the keyword you're looking for with Viktor most of the times, and if you get anything else, he often sits there kind of useless. But those times you do get elusive with him are insane. But him generating the Hex Core upgrade every turn is good for cards like Submersible, Neandroid, and Zoe anyway, so he does fit in with the deck, but your focus isn't really to level him in this deck. The main purpose of the deck is to buff up Neandroid using the Augment effect, so every time you use a created card, Neandroid gets one attack, and that combined with the elusive keyword means he can do a lot of damage to your opponent's Nexus, especially if he manages to live for multiple turns. I think this card is absolutely insane and ties the whole of this deck together. Submersible's the other card you're really playing towards, and this requires you to play 10 different cards in the game. And with this deck, it's quite easy. You'll see him running quite a lot of 2-ofs, and a lot of these cards create other cards. This allows you to proc Submersible really early on, so you can get the 5 attack really easily, and then you can attack in with your big elusives. And usually if you get both these units on the board, 2 attacks is enough to kill your opponent, sometimes 1 plus the additional burn cards. Because we're playing around these cards, I have a lot of create cards, so I run Spacey Sketcher, and this is a great card in this archetype. A lot of these other cards create fleeting cards, which are great discard targets for Spacey Sketcher. In fact, I'd say I rarely play Spacey Sketcher on turn 1, and what I like to do with Spacey Sketcher is wait until I play Ballistic Bot and use Spacey Sketcher to discard the Ignition, and this way you can generate card advantage quite early on in the game. Behold the Infinite is more of just an extra card. It's okay, and sometimes you can get lucky and pull out some of those really big win conditions which can help you seal games, and some of them are elusive as well, so that helps with your win condition, but most of the time I'm just using it to create a card, triggering both Neandroid and helping proc Submersible. Iterative Improvement's another great create card, and often actually what you do with this card is you use it on one of your opponent's unit. That way it generates you a different card, because if you use it on one of your units, it still counts as a created card, so that's great for your augmented units. But for Submersible and Zoe, you need to play different cards, so using it on your opponent's unit allows you to play a different card, and it helps for those 2 cards, which is why I'd recommend mostly using this on your opponent's cards. Mountain Goat, ever since its buff from 3-1 to 3-2, has been a solid Targon card, and it's the same in this deck, and he creates the gem, which is good. We also have Mentor of the Stones creating gems, so there is a bit of overlap, but that because these both create gems, it's not that good for Submersible and Zoe because they're the same card. But overall these cards are both really good for this deck, and plus Mentor of the Stones, if you can get his proc onto one of your elusive units, that's huge, giving them +2/+2. And also I run Guiding Touch, and this isn't a create card, but it replaces itself. So that helps with Zoe and Submersible as well, that you play this card, you draw another card, and maybe you'll be able to play that card as well, and that gets you 2 ticks towards both Zoe and Submersible. I also run Trail of Evidence, and this is quite a good card in this deck, just because it creates that create card, creates you another card, just plays for your win condition, and it's nothing that special. So if I had one of these other 2 drops in my hand, I'd probably rather play them, but as an alternative 2-drop, it's not bad. And sometimes it pulls Sumpwork maps, and when it does, that's insane. Sumpworks map works so well in this deck, but I wouldn't main deck it just because there's a lot of times it would brick. But so many times Trail of Evidence has pulled out the win for me because I got Sumpworks map, and then I played it on Viktor, who's got like 8 or 7 attack up by this point, and that does so much damage, and it's usually enough to finish off your opponent. And to help close out games with this deck, I also run a lot of burn cards. So these are Mystic Shot, Get Excited, and Aftershock. I'm running Aftershock mainly to destroy landmarks to deal with Grand Plaza decks, because those are running rampant, especially on EU ladder at the moment. So you almost have to bring some landmark removal, and Aftershock fits in well with this deck and is great for those matchups where you're against a landmark reliant deck. And finally, I'm running Pale Cascade, and if you're running a Targon deck at this point and you're still not running 3 copies of Pale Cascade, I don't know what's wrong with you. This card is insane. So there were some other cards I did consider. I considered Calculated Creations, but compared to Trail of Evidence, I feel this isn't as good because you still have to pay the full mana for all these units, whereas in Trail of Evidence, the cost of the card is reduced to 0 for the round you play Trail of Evidence, which means it's much more mana efficient than Calculated Creations. I tried Mechanized Mimic in the deck as well, and this card is quite good, but I found it was just too expensive, and often I never found a good time to play it. I never really needed the extra elusive unit, I just needed more burn or ways to keep my unit alive, and it just wasn't really necessary in this deck. It felt a lot like a win more card. I considered Hexcore Foundry as well, but you don't really run out of cards with this deck because it's quite an aggressive deck, and generally with aggressive decks you run out of cards because you have lots of low mana cost cards and you're playing multiple cards a turn. But with this deck, because you have lots of ways to cheat card advantage from your fleeting cards, you don't really run into this issue, so I didn't think Hexcore Foundry was really necessary. And the last card, which is decent consideration, is Poro Cannon, and I think this could fit really nicely in this deck, but at the moment I don't know what I would cut for it. If I had to make a 42 card deck, I would add 2 copies of Poro Cannon in, but for me all of these cards have been really helpful, and I was a bit concerned about not having enough discard fodder to make full use of this card. Generally when playing this deck, as I've said multiple times, your main aim is to proc Submersible and buff up the android, and your main focus should be around these units and not around protecting your champions. What I found many times with this deck is you often find a situation where you have to make a big decision with your burn cards of, do you go face or do you use them as removal? And there's not an easy answer for it, but my general rule is if I'm against a deck with healing, such as Targon or Shadow Isles are the main ones, I would not try and go face unless you're 100% sure you're going to kill them. Against deck combinations without healing, so not including those regions, you can be a bit more aggressive and start throwing your stuff in face even when your opponent has chances to respond. For the mulligan with this deck, you're mostly just looking for your early drops, which are Spacey Sketcher, Zoe, Ballistic Bot, and Mountain Goat. You also want to keep Neandroid so that you can start buffing his attack as soon as possible. And into some matchups, such as very aggressive decks, I've been seeing a bit of Teemo burn, so if you run into these Noxus Piltover burn decks, I also keep Mystic Shot and Get Excited so you can use these as removal. And against decks which are landmark reliant, such as Starspring, Sorokatan Kench decks, or any Demacia deck now which really runs Grand Plaza, because most Demacia decks now run Grand Plaza. Against those decks, I would also keep Aftershock in hand, just so you can use it as landmark removal the moment they put their landmark down, stopping them getting any advantage with it. Before we get into the game review next week, I'm going to be looking at a deck built around Quick Attack and using Challenger, so subscribe if you don't want to miss that deck. So for this game, we're up against a Garen Asol deck, which is a bit unusual. Demacia Asol decks are fairly common though. You use the strong Demacia cards to control the board early, and then you use Eclipse Dragon into Asol to finish off your opponents. It's actually a type of deck I really like. I like doing it with Shyvana. There's a lot of different versions of this deck, so with Leona, Lux, Garen, and Shyvana. I personally enjoy playing the Shyvana just because I love the Dragon playstyle, and I've got a deck guide on that if you want to check that out. So this hand we've got Zoe, and Zoe's always the card you want to see at the start. Behold the Infinite isn't that great early on. The issue with Behold the Infinite is because it can invoke any Celestial card, you can often get a high cost one, and if you get high cost options, it makes it not that great early on. So I prefer to not keep it in my hand. Submersible takes a while to proc that requirement of playing 10 other cards, so I don't keep that. I like keeping the Android in hand though, just because it's a unit we can start buffing up quite early on. Got 2 Pale Cascades, which is okay. Pale Cascades are strong, but I'm not a fan of seeing double copies of cards in hand, just because it reduces your options. Turn 1, we definitely play Zoe. There's nothing to do. We'll see what we draw here. Mentor of the Stone, so there's nothing decent to do. We just open attack. We don't use Pale Cascade because we want to proc the Nightfall, and using it for just 2 damage at the moment isn't worth it. He plays Grand Plaza, which is something we don't want to see, but at the same time, it almost gives us free development because a lot of Demacia's removal requires having a board. We know he can't use single combat to kill any of my units, so playing Mentor of the Stones here is really safe. We could develop first here, but then we have the risk of him playing a unit and being able to use single combat on Zoe, and I'd rather get the Zoe attack off now. And also the units we could develop are Neandroid and Viktor, and neither of them will get us that much damage. Neandroid will get us 1 more damage, and Viktor probably wouldn't be able to attack because any unit he plays on buffed up by Grand Plaza would make Viktor attacking a really bad trade for us. And he passes. This is really strange. At this point, again, he still doesn't have any board, so he can't play any units, so we just develop our strong units. Sometimes you want to keep some of your strong units behind, and at this point we might as well just play Viktor to be mana efficient. We get Aftershock here, which is great. We don't want him to get any more value from his Grand Plaza. We probably don't need to Aftershock this turn, but the only advantage of not using Aftershock is we can use double Pale Cascade. But double Pale Cascade wouldn't keep either Viktor or Zoe alive, so we might as well play the Aftershock here. We don't want to play Neandroid yet because that's one of our key units, and we don't want him to be able to kill it off with his unit while he has Challenger.
You must do better.
Be interesting to see what he challenges here. We want to keep Zoe alive. If he's smart, he'll hook Zoe, and he does take Zoe. We use the Pale Cascade here just to proc a response. He could have Sharp Sight or Pale Cascade of his own, but trading Pale Cascade for Pale Cascade, that's fine. The one thing we do need to be very concerned about against his deck is Sharp Sight as well, and forcing out Sharp Sights is great because then he can't use it to block any of our elusive units. Here I have the option of playing Zoe or using the Hexcore Foundry. I could play Zoe next turn where the Hexcore upgrade is this turn only, so it makes sense to use that card while I have it. I will get another one next turn, but this way I get 2 keywords on Viktor next turn rather than just getting the 1. I get Regeneration, which isn't bad. It's not great. Like, to be honest, the only one I really want to see is Elusive. As soon as I get Elusive, I'm happy. This turn, we could play Neandroid down, but I think playing Zoe here first is better. If he has removal, such as Concerted or Single Combat, he would use it straight onto the Zoe, and Neandroid is the unit we want to protect more. He still has enough mana to use Single Combat, which is something we do want to play around. So playing Neandroid isn't great here, just because Single Combat with Garen would be really bad against us. If we attack in with Mentor of the Stones, buffing Zoe, we can then use Pale Cascade on Zoe to trade with the Garen, and we can also use Pale Cascade on Viktor to trade with the Garen if he uses Single Combat on either of them. So we're in a fairly good position here. We just don't want to give him a decent target, and playing Neandroid gives him a decent target to Single Combat. Now I can actually play Neandroid here, because if he goes for a Single Combat with Garen, we can then use Pale Cascade and the Star Chart from Zoe to give Neandroid 4 attack, which I think would be a decent play, and it makes use of most of our mana. I go for the Hexcore upgrade, which probably isn't optimal, but it's not bad. We get Tough here. Tough is really good. That means he's safe from Single Combat now, and he has to use a Concerted Strike to kill him. The Star Chart costs 0 mana now, so I might as well use it. There is a case of potentially saving it for next turn so that we can use it to buff Neandroid up, but I think seeing what we get from it now over getting the extra attack next turn on Neandroid is more valuable. We get quite decent options. The Charger isn't that great. We're not really going to get any decent damage with Overwhelm, especially when he's got Garen. Equinox can be good, especially if you're against decks with elusive units. But in his deck, I don't believe he runs any elusive units, and any elusive units he gets from invoking will often have Spell Shield, making Equinox not that great against them. So the only really good choice is Moonglow, and Moonglow is actually really good right here on Viktor. Because if we go for the Moonglow, he might try and go for the Single Combat to stop it, but we have the Pale Cascade, which will keep him alive, and then he's got Regeneration, so he'd go back up to full health next turn, and that will just be insane. So he doesn't go for it, which suggests he doesn't have the Single Combat.
Stay resolute.
at this point, we've got a really scary Viktor. If we get Elusive on Viktor, it's just GG now. At this point, we might as well play Neandroid. The way he's played, it suggests he doesn't have single combat, and he doesn't have enough mana for Concerted Strike, so I believe the Neandroid will be fairly safe here. So we upgrade again. Viktor's pretty much got every keyword apart from Elusive. He'll finally hit it, hopefully. And at this point, we just want to use up our mana, be as mana efficient for our attack next turn. I used the gem on Viktor, and I believe that's a mistake, because Viktor doesn't have Elusive. He's not really going to attack in at the moment. And it could be tempting to block there with Viktor and use Pale Cascade, because then he would live on 1 health. But if he had Sharp Sight or another Pale Cascade of his own, it would have been a really, really bad trade for us. I'd much rather keep the Viktor alive and take the 7 damage. Especially when at this point, there's very few keywords left that he can get. I think possibly it's Fury and Elusive might be the only ones left that he can get. There's no reason to open attack here. These only good plays are things like Single Combat, Concerted Strike, or maybe using something like Sharp Sight to block. None of his options get better by us developing. So that's always the decision you've got to make at the start of each of your attacking rounds. What's better? If I develop and give him a turn to do something, does that give him a better option than any of his fast or burst speed responses? And Viktor gets the Elusive. So at this point, he needs Sharp Sight or something. But he can't block Viktor anyway, because Viktor's got quick attack, so he's going to take a bad trade into Viktor. This is a beast of a Viktor right here. And I just need to gem up and attack in. I decide to use all my gems on Viktor. Slightly suboptimal probably. I'm better off spreading out the damage. But that's GG. It's a great example to show you how this deck works. You focus on your elusive win condition. So I focused on using Mentor of the Stones on Zoe to buff her up. I protected my Neandroid, and only when I was sure or relatively certain that he didn't have any removal for it, I played it down and started buffing it up. And also, I churned out all those upgrades and looked for that elusive keyword. You might think I got lucky on that turn, he played Aesol, I get elusive, but Viktor pretty much had every keyword, I feel, at that point, so it was about due. And it's a perfect example of how this deck works. Scumbag elusive deck, just don't allow your opponent to block. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a like. Let me know in the comments below if there's any deck ideas you want me to try out. Next week, I'm going to be having a look at this quick attack challenger deck using Lucian and Katarina as its main champions. I'm still refining it at this moment, so it may change a little. But if you want to see that deck, subscribe so you don't miss it next week. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a good day.